Okay, well, what we're going to consider now is how the firm can use information about costs to maximize profits. The case that I'm going to discuss right here is kind of a special case, and you should keep that in mind. It's the case of the price-taking firm, and that's really the case that we've looked at so far when we thought about the market in terms of that model of supply and demand. One thing that came out of that was the market price. And we've already seen some discussion of this in the text when we thought of what that implied for the demand that faces the individual firm. So the concept that we saw in Chapter 5 when we were thinking about the elasticity of demand was that in a market, sort of a special market like this, the individual firm would face a demand which is in fact perfectly elastic. So that simply means the firm thinks about its market as if it can sell all it wants at the market price. So the way that we illustrated that demand curve was just to have a horizontal line that was actually the firm's demand. Now here, I've relabeled that marginal revenue, because if we just think about this in plain English, a perfectly elastic demand curve here simply says if the firm wants to sell some more output, it can do so at the market price. Well, that just means it's adding to total revenues an amount just equal to the market price. So marginal revenue is just defined as the amount of extra revenue a firm gets by selling an extra unit of output. That's just the market price. So that's this line here. And now we're going to combine that with the information that we've got about marginal costs. So picking up from the previous example, if we have a kind of U-shaped marginal cost curve here, this upward sloping part of that U, again reflecting the law of diminishing marginal productivity, then we can carry out the following logic. We can say, how can the firm use this kind of information about revenues and costs to maximize profits? You'll note here that we're not talking about total revenues and total costs. There's an example like that in the text. But we're phrasing things in terms of marginal revenue and marginal cost. You can really do it in both ways, comes to the same thing. But this kind of marginal thinking in terms of how people maximize profits or maximize utility is what's typically done in economics. So let's just run through the logic. If this market price tells us our marginal revenue, so our marginal revenue is this straight line that I explained a moment ago, and this is our marginal cost, then where should we produce? Well, you can see that in this range of output that I've drawn here, marginal costs are actually above marginal revenues. So that tells us if the firm were to produce a relatively small amount of output, the extra amount that it would be adding to its costs would be greater than what it's adding to its revenues. Well, that doesn't sound very good. But you can see that in this range, the firm is adding more to its revenues than to its costs. That's obviously a desirable situation. But once we get up to this point here, producing anywhere beyond that would clearly add more to our costs than it would add to our revenues. That would have to be decreasing profits. If we just translate what I've said into a story that shows the level of profits directly, what we can see is that there's possibly some range of output where the firm would be experiencing profits that are below zero, losses in other words, but the profits would increase if marginal revenues were greater than marginal costs. Profits are going up. They'll reach a maximum here where marginal revenues and marginal costs are just balancing each other out. Beyond that point where producing more output adds more to costs than it does to revenues, then profits must be falling. So this is telling us that profits are going to be maximized where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and where just beyond that, marginal costs are going to be greater than marginal revenues. You can see we would not be maximizing profits here, because if we produce a little bit beyond that, we can increase profits. We can add more to our revenues than to our costs. That's why I've drawn this profit function, this profit relationship between the level of profits and output continuously increasing here. There's one mistake that students often make, and I'll just point this out, and you better make sure you don't make this mistake. The idea is that students often look at this and they think, well, here's revenues, here's costs, we should maximize profits where the gap is the biggest. But you can see that's just plainly wrong here, because we're talking about marginal revenues and marginal costs, not total revenues and total costs. So if we were to stop here and produce this level of output, you can see that that could not possibly be maximizing profits, because we could produce a little bit more than that, if we look down here, and for every extra unit of output we produce, we keep adding more to revenues than we're adding to costs. We must be increasing profits by doing that. So we want to keep going until those things are just equal. That's where we're maximizing profits. So that's the basic logic of profit maximization in this special case where the firm just takes the market prices given. What we'll see when we go on to look at other kinds of markets is that the same logic of comparing marginal revenues and marginal costs and producing where those two are equal, that same logic is still going to hold. The picture, however, will look a little bit different. So that's what we'll see when we look at the analysis that's in Chapter 12 of the textbook.